Welcome, everybody. Today I'm speaking with someone who's just, she just comes on the podcast all the time. We're like BFFs. Her name is Dr. Taylor Arnold. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be back.
So I told her, I already warned her. I was like, oh my God, I have to tell you something that happened at Milo's school with regard to Cookie Day. And I also have a piece of artwork. So if you're not watching on YouTube, you won't get to see the artwork, but maybe I'll make a clip of it and share it on social media. So let's start with Cookie Day. So Milo's school, he's in kindergarten. They have pasta day on Monday. So you can like opt in for your child to get this little thing of pasta. They have cookie day on Tuesdays, popcorn day on Thursdays, and pizza day on Fridays. So we opted in for everything. I was like, I don't want him to feel left out on any of those days if everybody else is getting it. Like, I don't even think he likes popcorn, but I was like, whatever, sign him up. So Cookie Day happened a couple weeks ago, and it was Tuesday night, and after bath, we're laying in bed, and I'm like, oh, today was Cookie Day. Did you get your cookie? Like, just, making conversation. And he goes, no, I didn't get my cookie. And I was like, oh, why didn't you get your cookie? And he said, because I had chocolate in my lunch, so I didn't get the cookie. And I was like, okay, wait. So I'm thinking back to what he had in his lunch that day. And he had an oat bar, which was, and I went and looked at the nutritional content of it. It was 7 grams of sugar. It was an oat bar, and there was tiny little chocolate chips in the bar. So I'm assuming, and I kept asking him about it, and my husband looked at me and he was like, no, that can't be. And I'm like, as if a 4-year-old would make this up. So I was like, oh, so you didn't get the cookie because you, and he was basically saying yeah, I had too much chocolate in my lunch, so I didn't get the cookie. So first of all, I'm pissed because we paid ahead of time for him to have a cookie on Cookie Day. Second, all of a sudden you're putting in his mind that he can only have a certain amount of chocolate, and you're singling him out in the class if everybody else is getting their cookie, and it's like, oh, Milo, you have too much chocolate. So he's probably thinking well, what the hell's wrong with my mom? Why is she putting so much chocolate in my lunch? You know what I mean? And I was, and at the same time, so that day I gave him a seed butter and jam sandwich. And I was like, honestly, there's probably more sugar in that jam than there is in that oat bar. And also, if I gave him a Nutri-Grain bar, which is full of sugar, would you still give him the chocolate chip cookie because there's no chocolate in the Nutri-Grain bar? So that happened, and I was like, oh my God, oh my God. The next week, I purposely... I'm such a petty person. I purposely put, it's one of the Annie's granolas, and it's dipped in chocolate. So I purposely put that in his lunch on Tuesday to test it out before I send an email or something. And again, I ask him, I'm like, oh, did you get your cookie today? No, because I had chocolate in my lunch. And I was like, so
no.
Thoughts?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. If you're watching on YouTube, you could see I was exploding, trying to hold it back while Renee was talking. That is so frustrating to me. I have so many thoughts on this. Okay, first of all, this isn't a scientific, statement, but I do not think that it's the school's job to police what parents put in their kids' lunches. You, as an adult, can make an informed decision on what to feed your kid. And I don't think that the teachers or the administration or whatever needs to be interfering in that, as long as it's not unsafe for anybody in the classroom. It's not like you're sending a peanut bar in a peanut allergy school. Second, you are totally right that puts in the mindset, or that creates this mindset for kids that there's a limit to how much sugar, or there's a limit to how much chocolate I can eat at lunch. And it but they're not going to limit the broccoli. They're not going to limit the strawberries. They're not going to limit the sandwiches, but they're limiting the chocolate. They're limiting the cookies. So they're creating this like forbidden fruit mentality when it comes to these sweet foods. And Renee, I know we talked about this before. So I know you work really hard on helping Milo have a healthy relationship with food. Like you put a lot of thought.
I'm very aware. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So you put a lot of thought, you put a lot of time into this. And like for that just to happen with like kind of disregard to what structure you're putting in place at home can be really frustrating. And I know on the flip side of things, like not all families are like yours or mine. Like some really try to limit or avoid sugar altogether. And so teachers are trying to like navigate how to accommodate all different families' beliefs. But like that can be accommodated by the family not signing up for the cookie and just not sending sugar in their own kid's lunch. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is taking it totally a step too far in policing our kids' lunches. And frankly, our teachers and our school administration and staff are not trained to address nutrition with the kids. And I don't think it's fair to teachers. Like teachers message me all the time and say, I have to implement these rules that I disagree with, but it's required by the district. And so like, I don't think the blame should be on teachers either. It's not fair to them that they have to do this stuff too. So I don't like this policy.
This was what I was curious about. Like, where did this come from? Like, who is the person that was like, you know what? If it's cookie day and they have a sign of chocolate in their lunch, like I'm not looking at sugar content, a Nutri-Grain bar is fine. Jam sandwich, that's okay. But if there's chocolate, then they don't get their cookie. It's like, where did this rule come from? And what is like backing it?
Yeah, I think it's well-intentioned. I honestly do. I don't think that this is like a malicious thing that the school districts are like trying to cause problems. Like, I think that they think sugar is bad. We need to help our kids see that sugar is bad. So we're going to limit sugar for them because the parents can't do it. That's kind of where I think it's coming from.
Where I get frustrated is
which is frustrating.
It's not sugar. Because right. If it was a Nutri-Grain bar, which has more sugar than that oat bar, they wouldn't say anything because it's not chocolate. You know, right. It's like instead of teaching the value of certain foods and what it does for our bodies and stuff, exactly. It's more so like they just want to label chocolate and certain things and like limit things instead of actually looking at what the food is and what right. It is made up of.
Right. And I mean, we have research to show that dichotomous thinking when it comes to food, so labeling it as like good or bad, clean, unclean, like fuel food, fun food, whatever words you want to use. Like people try to say, well, I don't use good or bad, I use fuel and fun. It's still dichotomous thinking. You're still putting it into two buckets. That is negatively associated with, or it is associated with unhealthy relationships with food or like disordered eating behaviors. And then moralizing food has an association with disordered eating behaviors. And so both of those things come up when you say like sugar is bad, for example. So I don't believe sugar is bad. It's just a food. It does some things in our bodies, some things that help our bodies and some things that don't help our bodies. And that's how I present it to kids. But you know, I think schools shouldn't be policing this because there are some kids who are like really selective or they have a pediatric feeding disorder or what, like maybe have a sensory sensitivity and like that bar is the only thing that mom can send in the lunchbox to know that he's going to get some energy and to make it through the rest of the day. And so like, for example, my son is a selective eater and I love sending my daughter all these like nutritious and wonderful lunches. And like, if I try to do that for my son every day, he doesn't eat. So like he eats peanut butter and jelly or nut butter and jelly sandwiches pretty much. And you know, like I want him to get energy and calories in during the day because he wasn't gaining weight. And so like, let's say the one thing he would eat was that bar and I sent it in and now he's being punished.
Yeah.
And not getting a cookie. Like people don't know what's going on behind the scenes with that. And I just think that is really problematic. So I do not like
for
that.
Me, it's not even about like the cookie. It's about the whole like process of being like, oh, you can't have your cookie because you already have chocolate in your lunch and like everyone else is getting their cookie and Milo's like, what is going through his little 4-year-old mind, you know?
Right.
Like he's not able to comprehend it. At your school, maybe we've talked about this before. Have you heard of them being like, you have to eat your healthy things first?
Yes. So yes, I have. A lot of cafeterias have that policy in place, which I also disagree with. I actually have a letter in my Patreon membership that parents can send to schools to discourage that. And it has a bunch of scientific sources to support the negative impacts. But basically, if we pressure kids to eat something, it makes them like it less. And so these schools are like pressuring their kids to eat veggies first, in hopes that they're going to, get their nutritious foods in and start to learn to taste it and be exposed to it and maybe like it. But that actually backfires. And so I don't like that mentality. I think if kids are not eating their lunches, we kind of need to go back to what is being sent. We need to work with the parents individually. Perhaps if there's like some special needs going on, we need an IEP plan for like a quiet lunchroom time. Like there's other strategies we can take other than forcing kids to eat. And I do know that some parents want their kids to be forced to eat because everybody has differences in, their nutrition approaches with their kids. But I personally believe, as an expert in nutrition and feeding kids, that the school should be implementing the evidence-based approach. And if parents want something different for their kid, then they need to figure out how to adjust it on their end, not the school's end.
I've always thought, just because I am like somewhat well-versed in this area and have thought a lot about like food relationships.
Right.
To me, it was always like, if you're like, oh, you have to eat X, Y, and Z, like your carrots and your broccoli before you can have your cupcake, like as an example. You're putting now the cupcake up on a pedestal as like this prized possession. Like, oh, I just have to get through this to eat this.
Totally.
And so you're like dismissing the value of eating the carrots and the broccoli and what good it is for you and the nutrition in there and all that. And you're just kind of like, you have to eat this in order to get that. And so like, even like, I know the intent is good. Like, yes, you want children to eat fruits and vegetables. Right. Like, that's great. Right. Like, I love that. The intention is good, but it's like going about it in the wrong way. So this artwork that I'm about to show you. So
I can't wait to see.
My husband,
like zooming in on the screen here.
Okay, my husband's so funny. Like, he comes home, he had picked up Milo this day, and he's like clearing out his backpack, and I'm still like in my office working, and he's like, oh, you're gonna love this. And he like hands it to me, and I was like, oh my God. So since Milo was little, I have been very mindful to not call things treats. Like, I don't call things treats. Yes, because for all the reasons I just discussed, like it puts these foods up on a pedestal, like, oh, this is like the treat. So I've always been mindful to not do that. And I noticed that Milo started to call things treats like a few weeks ago. This all started like when he started kindergarten. So obviously they call things treats. I started to pick up on it. I was like, why is he asking for a treat? Like, we've never used that word. So anyways, I get this artwork. It's so funny. It's like healthy food.
Oh, no.
On one side, and then treats on the other side. With like ice cream and cake and fruits and veggies on the healthy side. And I was like, okay. Again, it's like, we are just going to label and categorize foods instead of like just being like, all these things are foods. They all do different things for your bodies. Like, let's talk about what they do for our bodies, you know?
Right. Exactly. So so my approach with that is to ditch the dichotomous thinking. We don't have to have two buckets. I think a kindergartner is very capable of describing each item on its own. So like, this is sweet, it's cold, it's crunchy, it's squishy, it gives me energy that lasts a long time. It gives me quick energy that goes away fast. It helps me poop. It, makes me feel really full. There's so many ways we can describe food. And I'm going to throw a plug in here for my friend Danny at Kid Food Explorers, because she has activities for teachers that are an excellent replacement for the thing that you just showed me. And parents have messaged me like, what do I do about this? Because I've had people tell me that they have their kids do this exact same activity. And I say, go buy her activity and gift it to your child's teacher and say, hey, this would be a great thing to use instead. And like,
what was it called?
Her name is Danny, and her handle is Kid Food Explorers. And she makes like these activities for kids to learn about food that are free of diet culture. And it's more just like learning about the food and the characteristics of the food. So many people use activities like that. And, you know, it's well-intentioned, but I don't like it. I don't like it.
My husband, so like the other day, he's clearing out his backpack again. And I'm like, oh, is there any diet culture propaganda in there this time?
You know, we can't teach them. I mean, we can't shield them from it forever. They're going to get it.
I
but
know.
Man, it's a shock when they get exposed to it at like 3, 4, 5. And it's like, I can't believe this is starting already. You're so little, you know?
I know. Anyhow, okay, we're going to get into the actual topic that we're supposed to talk about today. I just had to, I was like, this is perfect timing. Like, I'm going to talk to her, and I've been meaning to get all this like off of my chest somehow. So this was perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Feeding babies. My sister just recently started, and by feeding, I should specify solids.
Yes.
Not
food.
Not milk or formula.
Right.
So yes, starting solids with babies. So I put up a question sticker on Instagram, and people sent in pretty typical questions. So I think I'm going to try and go through them in a way that makes a little bit of sense. The first question I'll ask is when to start solids. I think a lot of people were confused, saying that, you know, some people recommend starting like cereals at like 4 months, but online it says 6 months. And I'm sure every baby is different. So what are some things that people can look out for, like to know when to start feeding their baby?
That's a good question. So first of all, babies, like there's no switch that like flips and like all of a sudden one day they're not ready for food and the next day they immediately are. Like it's a progression and it's skill based. So we say 6 months is typically the age that is recommended to start solids because that's around the age when kids start meeting the milestones that they need to have in order to safely eat food. So like sitting independently, we want good head and neck control. We want to be able to bring things to their mouth. We should be able to lateralize things in the mouth. So like if you put your finger gently in the front of their mouth, they should be able to like move it side to side of their tongue. They should be able to push something out of their mouth with their tongue. So like a teether toy, for example. And then they should have interest in food. So like one of those things, for example, interest in food is not an indication to start solids. I know babies like oftentimes are interested in whatever we're doing, especially around that 4-month mark when they really like are not a newborn anymore. They're like a real little baby.
A real human.
But just right. But because they're interested in food, that's not like a reason to start solids in and of itself. Now, the World Health Organization recommends 6 months. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends between 4 and 6 months to reduce the risk for allergen introduction or to reduce the risk for food allergy development. And that's because that's the ideal window for introducing allergens in order to reduce the risk, mainly for egg and peanut. And then we take that data that we have about egg and peanut and say, well, it probably applies to the other major allergens. So it's probably also good to introduce it within that time frame, but we don't really have the data to say like that works for shellfish and that works for soy, for example. It's mostly just egg and peanut. There's a couple smaller studies on other allergens. So I usually recommend that we want to hit those milestones between the 4 and 6 month mark. And once that happens, we want to start and focus on allergen introductions as quickly as possible and get those in early and often and keep them in your baby's diet. Like that and having iron foods are the number one priorities when we start solids introduction. So if you have a pediatrician that says, your baby's 4 months, start solids, that's way outdated advice. Oftentimes they're old. I don't want to have some ageism here, but like it's true. A lot of when people message me that, I'm like, were they old? And they're like, yeah, they're ancient.
Well, if they don't keep up with the research, then yeah, we're going off what they learned.
Yeah. So just seeing your baby's 4 months start solids, that's way outdated. And that is not an evidence-based way to practice nutrition or medicine. We need to look at the individual child and see what milestones they've met within that 4 to 6 month range. And then we can start allergen introduction. Now, let's say you have a kid who's super high risk for allergies. If you want to start with purees a little bit earlier than they're like sitting fully by themselves for like 3 seconds at a time, that's okay to do that as long as we have neck and trunk control and they're like able to sit with a little bit of support in the high chair without like, flopping over like a, I don't know, like one of those reborn dolls that just like, like we don't want that. They need to have proper head and neck control. That's the most important thing for safety. And if your baby doesn't meet those milestones, then you need to work with an occupational therapist or a physical therapist to help determine the safest way to feed them.
So let's say, okay, my baby is like 5.5, 6 months old. I'm going to start feeding them solids.
Yep.
You were saying to introduce allergens as quickly as possible. So like,
yes.
So let's say, okay, I'm going to start solids this weekend. Like, what should my plan? I think a lot of people are confused with like, what do we start with? And then if I start with something, how often are you introducing new things after that first introduction?
Okay, that's a good question. So as far as like the first food that you start them with, I get that question all the time. What is the first food? It honestly doesn't really matter that much. I think the first food is an exciting family event. So you should pick something that is fun for you to serve. Because, like we want to focus on allergens, we want to focus on iron, but like one meal isn't going to make or break your baby's health. So like fun foods to do are like avocado, sweet potato, banana. You could do cereal if you want, but if you do choose cereal, I recommend an oat cereal, not a rice cereal. You could do purees if you want. It's not necessary. You can do like the avocado spears, the banana pieces, the sweet potatoes, as long as they pass the squish test. You should be able to squish them between your fingers and they should mush. And, that's kind of the texture you want for babies, assuming they're, meeting all of their motor milestones, for example, and there's no underlying medical complexities that they have. And then allergens. So if your baby is not high risk for allergies, you don't need to like introduce one new food and wait 3 days and do another food and wait 3 days. I only recommend that 3-day window if it's one of the top 9 allergens. So for example, do you want me to list them? So we have them on here. Okay. All right. Ready? I'm gonna make sure I get them all. Okay. So it's peanuts, tree nuts, eggs, soy, milk, sesame, fish, shellfish, and wheat. Those are the 9 allergens. So I think the easiest one to introduce first is wheat, which is bread, because bread or toast is a great vehicle to introduce other things to your baby, like spread it on the bread. So you want it well toasted because you don't want it to make like a squishy gummy ball in their mouth because that's a choking risk. That's why we toast it for babies and not just like throw them out a loaf of bread. And then every 3 days, introduce a new allergen, and we want to keep it in your baby's diet regularly. So we should be including those allergens at least 3 times a week, if not more. Keep in mind a couple things here. If you are a working parent, I don't recommend you introducing an allergen and then sending your kid to daycare. So oftentimes for working parents, that looks like introducing 1 allergen or 2 allergens a week, and doing that as quickly as possible. You really want to get it in before the 6-month mark, which is why it's harder for working parents to do that. So I recognize that that's tough. But ideally, we want to get it in before the end of the 6th month, closer to the first half of the 6th month if we can. And I mean, there's tons of ways to introduce the allergens. I have a whole list of how to introduce each allergen, like what foods are ideal, plus a calendar, a 30-day breakfast calendar that has allergens included. And that's all for free inside of my Feeding Baby 101 course, inside of that ebook. That's also for free. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, but like, okay. I'm just in shock because, Milo's 4, but in my mind, I'm like, has he ever had shellfish? Like, we don't eat that. Well, I don't. My husband would, but I don't eat it, so it's never in our house. So we never, like, I don't think he's had shellfish. I think everything else he probably has, but like, yeah.
And that's a great point too. Like, if it's not culturally important to you, and you can't keep it in your baby's diet on a weekly basis, like let's say your family is vegan, for example, and you're raising your kid vegan and you don't want to cook the fish, or like, we don't really eat fish that much. So it's kind of hard to keep fish in our kids' diet on a regular basis. You just kind of have to be a little more on high alert for that food. So like, let's say Milo's never had shellfish. I wouldn't really give him shellfish for the first time, like at a restaurant or like at your parents' cabin maybe, and you don't have access to medical care, like quickly, for example. You just kind of have to keep those things in mind. Or like, my husband is allergic to tree nuts. And so we serve almonds in our house, but like my kids have never had pecans because that's my husband's biggest trigger. And like, he can't even be in the room with the pecan because he smells it and his throat starts swelling. So like, you just have to do what you can, the best you can, and know that your kid is going to be at a higher risk if you're not introducing those foods. And for some families, that's worth it. Like for me, that's worth it for my family to not put my husband at risk for an allergic reaction multiple times a week.
Right. You're like, sorry, honey.
Right. I mean, like I had big plans to do it at my mom's house, but then COVID hit and we like weren't seeing anybody. And so it just kind of fell off the radar. And now I am on high alert when they're around pecans, and I wouldn't like give it to them for the first time when we don't have a plan in place.
So let's like, I'm going to use my sister as an example. So her baby is 7 months old. She's starting to eat solids, mostly purees. So how long, let's say they start introducing allergens. I think they have already done quite a few, but what's the point of keeping it regularly in your diet, and for how long do you have to do that?
That's a great question, and we don't really have a firm research answer. So I recommend at least for the first 6 months until your baby turns a year, and then trying to keep them in rotation as often as possible beyond that. But also, like, what the science tells us and what is actually realistic for families often don't like mesh super well. So I think it's important for parents to be informed and then do the best they can, and know that like you being stressed around food and you being stressed around mealtime also has a negative impact on your child. So if you're like hating mealtimes with your kids because you're so worried about introducing allergens, like maybe we need to scale it back a little bit and just do the best you can with the resources and the mental capacity and the mental like space that you have available to you.
Yeah, it's like anything with parenting. It's like, this is, what's recommended, and like in an ideal situation we would do XYZ, but at the end of the day, everybody has like their own capacity for what they can do based on their schedule, their resources, their everything. And that's just like, oh, man, I just fed Milo like, what was it, 3.5 years ago, like started feeding him solids, and I'm like, holy shit, I did everything wrong.
And food allergies they're relatively uncommon in infants. And so, if that's the case, your kid's probably going to be fine. But if we want to do the most we can to reduce the risk, there is like a methodical way that we can introduce allergens. And there are some kids who are at higher risk who it's more important for. So like if they have eczema, if they have the family history of any atopic conditions, which would be like asthma, food allergies, seasonal allergies, eosinophilic esophagitis, FPIES, any of those like a celiac, any allergic conditions in the parents, your kid is going to be at a higher risk for food allergies. So those families definitely need to take more care into making sure that they're introducing allergens early and including them in the diet often.
So I'm going to squeeze in a question that my sister had for you. So this morning, she FaceTimed me and she was feeding Poppy avocado spears.
Okay.
She's kind of like me. Like, I tried to do baby-led weaning and I was so anxious that I was like, we're just going to puree everything. But she's like trying every once in a while to do like give her an avocado spear, for example. So she was wondering, she was following the rules of like, you want it to be this big, this long, and like squishy, whatever. But then like the second Poppy grabs it to bring it to her mouth, it like breaks in half. So she's like,
Yeah.
is this garbage now? Like, cause it's a choking hazard, or like, do I give her a fresh spear? Like, she was concerned about
the
this.
size, like the whole, like it needs to be your finger, it needs to be this wide. That's more for the baby to grab it. And less for reducing choking risk. The texture is going to be what's more important for reducing choking risk. Just because babies have the palmar grasp, which means they can grab like around something in their palm. They're not quite developed the pincer grasp, which means they can pick something up with their thumb and forefinger. And babies develop that at various ages. Like my daughter got that at 7 months, and some babies develop it at 9 months. It just depends on the kid. So the texture of the avocado, as long as it's not one of those like rock hard avocados that you're too impatient for and you cut open anyways, is usually a fine texture for babies. The size of it is more to make it easier to eat. And then if you're nervous about baby-led weaning, we can still do like texture progression outside of like whole foods. So like you could give them cottage cheese, that's chunky. You give them chunky guacamole. You could give them like oatmeal with some like mashed up raspberries. Like that's all chunky and beyond just like the perfectly strained pureed that is in like baby food jars. So we could still move them along the texture progression without necessarily giving them like the big pieces if that makes you uncomfortable.
Okay. So to feed kids with baby-led weaning, I feel like it's pretty straightforward. Like you give them the certain foods, you put it in front of them, and they go to town.
As long as it's safe, yes.
Yeah. So let's say they're not eating a lot. And also, let's say you're doing puree and you're like, okay, you put it like a little dish with the little baby spoon in front. How much are the parents supposed to be like putting it to their mouth, like feeding them, versus letting them just play around?
I actually, if there's not any developmental concerns, I recommend that parents don't feed their kids directly to their mouth at all. So if it's a puree, I usually recommend parents load the spoon with the puree and either put it on the tray or put it in their baby's hand and let them self-feed. Now, you can spoon feed and practice responsive feeding. It's just a little harder to notice babies' cues and to make sure that you're not overfeeding them. But, you know, we can look at like pursing their lips, turning their head away, swatting the spoon are all ways that baby tells you that they don't want it. But like the whole baby-led weaning thing has been like adopted by internet extremists and like taken past where the science is and be into like this zone of like Facebook mom group extreme activists, and it's just a little much for me. So I prefer the term baby-led feeding. Mm-hmm. You're feeding the child and you're following their lead. You can do that with purees. You can do that with table foods. It doesn't, the key is being responsive to what the baby is telling you. And that can happen with any sort of safe, prepared food. Okay. So, yeah.
I am going to send this to my sister immediately. Because this morning she keeps asking me all these questions about feeding, and I'm like, Liza, like, I don't know. I just pureed everything and like fed Milo. Like I was like, let me ask Taylor today. Like, and so she was like, can you overfeed a baby? I'm like, no, like you just.
I mean, if you're spoon feeding and you're completely ignoring their cues, you can.
Now this all makes sense. But because she asked me like, should I just be letting her, you know, play around with the food and like feed herself, or do I like spoon feed her? Because oh my god, over the holidays I was just like feeding Poppy like shoving oatmeal in her mouth, like here you go, she loves it. Like, so this is good to know. Like it's wild. Like yeah.
And I'd encourage you to talk to Liza if you're listening. Think about the reason why it stresses you out, because I think a lot of people say like, I'm worried about choking, but if we look at the literature, there is not a higher risk of babies choking when it comes to baby-led weaning. And babies who are fed a baby-led weaning approach do have a higher incidence of gagging at 6 months, but they actually have a lower incidence of gagging at 8 months. So that suggests that babies are like going through a period where they're going to gag. And if you feed them purees, you're just delaying it. You're not preventing anything. So, you know, I think it gets out of the way faster, and then you're over that phase.
Yeah, I know. And like, I think people, myself included, are super afraid of gagging.
Yeah, I mean, that's warranted because it is not a fun experience to go through as a first-time parent. Like, it is scary. I totally agree. And I think the best thing you can do in that situation is to take a CPR and first aid and choking intervention course so you know what to do should that issue arise. Because I think that's honestly the best thing you can do. And when we look at the literature, the choking incidents were self-reported by the parents, and half of them were on milk. So it makes me kind of wonder, like, it might not have been choking. It may have been an error in reporting when parents saw gagging and actually thought it was choking, but it wasn't. And a large portion of those choking incidents were due to improperly prepared or unsafe foods being offered to a baby. So, for example, an apple slice is not a safe food, a raw apple slice for a baby. And like, that's where one of the choking incidents happened in this literature, or in this case review, or I want to say it was a meta-analysis. I'd have to go back and look at exactly what type of paper it was. But it's predominantly from improperly prepared foods that we're seeing these choking incidents.
For parents there were a lot of questions from parents with kids of different ages, like 6 months, 8 months, even 16 months, that were worried that their child is not interested in eating. So, and this was one of my sister's questions as well, was like, over the course of like the age groups, how much should they actually be eating? So my sister Googled like a 7-month-old, how much they should be eating. And it was like 9 tablespoons a day. But like, who knows where this information is from? And like,
ignore that.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Like, you could probably find anything online.
Yeah.
So what's your recommendation?
We should still be feeding on demand. We shouldn't be, or feeding milk, breast milk or formula on demand. We shouldn't be decreasing milk feeds throughout that first year until we're getting like really close to 1, if you wish to wean at 1, for example. But it's about the times that you offer the food. That's what I like to focus on rather than the actual amount. So like a 7-month-old, for example, should be eating 1 to 2 meals per day. And then we give them small amounts of a couple different foods, a balanced meal, including iron-rich foods, fats, proteins, grains, or some sort of other starchy carbohydrates. We want to give them exposure to produce, fruits, vegetables. This doesn't have to be at every meal, but ideally iron at every meal. And let them tell you how much they want to eat. And as long as the child is gaining weight appropriately, then we're not worried for the most part. As long as they're consuming some iron-rich foods and their iron status is good, we're not worried. If a child, for example, was like struggling with weight gain and they were 7 months old, I would never say, let's bump up their solid intake. I would say, we need to work on their milk intake. We need to possibly increase their milk intake. We might need to fortify their milk intake. We need to do something with that. I'm not relying on solids for their growth from the 6 to 12 month mark. I'm relying on solids for their iron intake. And if your kid is really struggling, we want to focus on a positive eating experience. And so a supplement is a possibility if your kid has low iron. Like, there's ways to ensure that your kid is having a positive experience with solids by exploring and eating what they want to in the moment. And even with like kids with an oral aversion, we still don't do like high pressure feeding. We keep it fun. We keep it simple. We meet them where they're at. So there's no like, your 7-month-old should be eating so many tablespoons, or your 10-month-old should be eating so many tablespoons. We should feed them the appropriate number of times per day, give them a balanced meal, and encourage them to eat themselves, or eat, the food themselves.
So it's like, don't stress so much about the amount of food, but like, think about the nutrition that they're getting instead.
Yeah, I mean, think about the nutrition you're offering them. Don't stress like, oh, I offered an iron-rich food, they didn't eat it. Like, oh my gosh, they're going to have low iron. Like, for example, my son, I think he has a texture aversion, my current baby. And so, my other kids, I did full-on baby-led weaning. I didn't really do any purees, but this kid, like, doesn't really like the whole foods right now. So I will give him some whole foods. And then I was noticing, okay, he's not eating any of the meat I offer because he doesn't like the texture. So now I'm doing some pureed meats because I'm like seeing where that's responsive feeding. I'm looking at what he needs, what he's telling me. And I'm offering a different iron source, and I put it on a spoon and I let it let him feed himself, even though it's disgusting when he gets pureed beef in his hair. But that's another thing.
So someone's question was ideas for iron-rich foods.
Okay.
Like, what are iron-rich foods?
So pretty much any meat is going to be rich in iron. And then beans are also a great source of iron. Broccoli has a little bit of iron in it. Greens have iron, but you need a lot of greens to actually meet that. Soy can be an iron-rich food. But we need to keep in mind that when we offer a plant-based food that has iron in it, we also want to offer a vitamin C source, because iron from animals is more easily absorbed, and we need the vitamin C in the gut to reduce the iron in the plant foods so that we can absorb that iron. So, for example, like if you're serving beans, like give them a smoothie with some frozen mango in it, or like give them an orange wedge that has the peel, taken off of it, or strawberries are a great source of vitamin C. Give them a big ass strawberry with their meal and just let them go to town and chew on it. Like, there's lots of ways to increase that iron absorption there. Or you can even look, like, a lot of pouches that have beans in it will also have a vitamin C source in it too, because, the food manufacturers hopefully keep that in mind. So that's something that you can do as well. So there's lots of choices.
Okay, next question. To introduce meat to your child, like what age and how? People were specifically wondering about like chicken and beef. Like, how do you safely give that to a child?
That's a really good question. So you can start from 6 months, and you can either do purees. You can do flaky fish is a super, like salmon is a great safe food for infants. You can do a really nice tender, like short rib. You could do like drumstick. That's probably a little bit more of a challenging baby-led weaning food in terms of the parents being okay with their kid like gnawing on a drumstick, chicken drumstick with the skin removed. You could even put some like steak pieces in one of those like mesh feeders and let them like gnaw on it and suck the juices out of it. Like, that's a great way for them to be exposed to the texture and the taste of not doing a puree. So there's options there. I also love, like, Solid Starts is a great resource for they have this like whole food database where you can look up the food and it tells you like safe options to introduce by age. So like that's a great place to look as well. But you can definitely do meat from 6 months for sure. Eggs, you can scramble them in a bowl, pour them and let them cook flat like an omelet. And then you just cut little strips. You can do hard boiled egg, like wedges are a great way to introduce animal products like that. So we have options.
Yeah, I remember I used to puree all these little, I think I have a highlight reel on my Instagram that's like baby food, and it's like all the little recipes that I made him when he was a baby.
Yeah. Oh, so cute.
Like, there's so many options. Like, I would put in like quinoa and like green beans and like chicken and like blend it up, put it in pouches in the freezer, and then I would do like cherries and like you can.
Oh yeah, that sounds awesome.
When you're blending stuff, like the options are endless. You just like
it's true.
Create these little like it's actually kind of fun.
Yeah.
Anywho, okay. How soon would an allergic reaction show up if they were to be allergic? I know you said to stay home, like don't just like give them an allergen and then send them to school.
Yeah.
But, like, is it something that usually shows up quickly or can it be delayed?
Yes. Well, usually it shows up quickly. So allergic reactions usually show up within minutes. But keep in mind that it's often not the first time a baby is exposed to the food that they'll develop a reaction. So the way allergies work is your body needs to first be sensitized to the food, meaning you need to be exposed to the food. Your body needs to recognize it as a threat, create the antibodies to that food. And then the next time you consume it, your body has the antibodies and they'll be like, danger, danger, and then cause the allergic reaction. So sometimes that happens on the second exposure. Sometimes that happens on the 10th exposure. Like, kids can develop allergies into their childhood, even into adulthood. My grandma developed a shellfish allergy like 10 years ago. So like,
oh wow.
So, parents who are like, I'm feeding for the first time peanuts in the pediatric ER parking lot. Like, I mean, like we can develop a peanut allergy at any time. So doing that is just kind of like a high stress situation that you're putting yourself into. So an allergic reaction, an anaphylactic allergic reaction will usually show up within minutes. Symptoms can include difficulty breathing, hives, like babies can claw at their face. They can have like a look, this is a little, graphic, but they can have a look of terror on their face. Their lips can swell. You can hear some wheezing or like high-pitched whistling, breathing. Those would be all symptoms of an allergic reaction, immediate vomiting. But there are some more rare types of food allergies. My kids, all three of them have this. It's called FPIES, which stands for food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome. And this happens when a child will have delayed vomiting or in some cases diarrhea, like 2 to 4, sometimes even 6 hours after eating a food. So oftentimes this looks like a kid waking up in the middle of the night and puking, like projectile exorcist style puking after eating like an avocado or a sweet potato or a banana. And the parents are like, oh, it's a stomach bug, but it keeps happening. So I'm just going to avoid like avocado. And then 10 years down the road, they're like, oh my gosh, wait. You're talking about FPIES, Dr. Taylor? My kid had that. And it's so weird that we're just talking about this now. So like that's a possibility as well. And in some cases it can be mild where you just give Zofran at home and they're fine. And in other cases they become lethargic and need to go to the emergency room for IV anti-nausea medication and fluids. So most allergies happen right away. Some can be delayed.
Is that FPIES only for certain things, or can it be for anything?
It can be anything.
Wow.
Yeah, anything. So my daughter's FPIES was to eggs, my son's was to wheat, and we're pretty sure my third, we're still testing it under the supervision of an allergist to see if it's avocado or fish. I think it's fish. Pretty sure it's fish. But like, kids can have it to all grains. Kids can have it to oatmeal. I'm pretty sure Sarah from the Papaya podcast, her daughter has like an oat allergy or FPIES. You can have a beef. You can have it to different veggies. Like FPIES is a lot harder.
Do people grow out of it?
Oh yeah. Most of the time people grow out of FPIES between the ages of 3 to 5 years old. So my first 2 kids have grown out of their FPIES. Not always, but it is very rare for adults to have FPIES, but it is possible. And it's also more rare for older kids to have FPIES, but that is also possible too.
Okay. 2 more questions.
Okay.
How often, I think I know the answer, but how often should you keep trying a food with your child if they don't like it? Like they're not
keep going. Just keep going in perpetuity.
Yeah. Exactly.
With babies, I'm assuming this is directed at a baby because your question box is babies. But like babies making this face of like disgust isn't necessarily them being disgusted. Like you are giving, like they have had either a boob nipple or a bottle nipple in their mouth their whole life and the taste of formula or breast milk and maybe a couple teethers. And that is it. That is all that like the sensory experiences that they have had in their mouth, maybe their hands too. And now all of a sudden they're tasting broccoli. Like, can you imagine only tasting sweet breast milk or sweet formula and then someone gives you broccoli with garlic on it? You'd be like, what the heck is this? Yeah. Of course you would make a face. So, if they make faces, it doesn't mean they don't like it. It's just new to them. And so present it in different ways. Keep offering it, especially if it's something that's important culturally or personally to your family, like something you eat a lot. Don't give up on that. Don't say my baby doesn't like it, I'm not going to offer it, because that is a surefire way to create a selective toddler down the road.
So like Milo was never into eggs. Like, I eat eggs all the time. So like I would always try and give him like scrambled eggs. No, not interested. But he's obviously had a bunch of eggs if they're in something like baking and stuff like that. So I knew like an allergy wasn't an issue. So the other day, and this just goes to show, like I just never really give him eggs anymore. I should. I'm bad. But I boiled eggs and I'm sitting there eating my boiled eggs and he's like, oh, I'll have an egg. I'm like, what? Like, what is happening? So I go and randomly I had boiled 3. So I give him a boiled egg and he's just like eating the egg. He has not eaten an egg his entire life. He's 4. So like, you never know. You never know. That's what I always tell my husband. Like, my husband's always like, oh, he's not going to eat it. Like, we had tacos the other night. And I'm like, you just have to put it in front of him. And all of a sudden, one day, he's going to eat it. And it's going to be so, like like, what? Where did this come from? But it's so true. Just keep putting it in front of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know, exposure goes, and we've talked about this on the other episodes that I've been on here too, but exposure goes just beyond just setting it in front of them. Like, we can make it fun. We can have games. We can use novelty tools. We can expose our kids to food through like imagery and books. And there's other ways to help them like a new food. So if you say like, I put broccoli on their plate 30 times and they're not eating it, well, like, how are you? Are you just plopping a big old hunk of broccoli on their plate? Or like, are you giving them a food pick? Are you having a floor picnic with the broccoli? Are you pretending to be dinosaurs eating the broccoli? Like, there's so many ways. My daughter, we went to a museum with dinosaurs today, and my daughter on the way home was like, I want to be a dinosaur at lunch. And I was like, well, dinosaurs eat leaves. She's like, well, I want to eat leaves. And I was like, okay. So I literally grabbed a handful of plain spinach and put it next to her pizza. And she was eating the leaves like, I'm a dinosaur. And I was like, you go, girl. Yes, you are a dinosaur. Like, she ate like a whole handful of spinach pretending to be a dinosaur. It was great.
I love this so much. I know, it's so interesting how like all of a sudden they just start eating something. Like, we always say, like, oh, like Spider-Man eats that, or, you know, and he's like,
right.
Really? Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
I like that.
It's like, it's too funny. Okay, last question. Are there any foods, and let's just make it like, let's say 12 months and under, any foods that you should be avoiding giving your kids?
Yes.
Like foods to avoid.
Yes, honey. You should not give your kids honey. Anything unsafe. So, well, the reason we shouldn't do honey is because the risk of botulism is very high. So that includes things baked with honey, because the botulism spores, which is spores of a bacteria, survive extremely high heats. So like bread made with honey, for example, those spores will survive the baking temperature of bread. So that's why we want to avoid honey altogether in stir fries, in breads, on top of anything.
Why
no
doesn't
honey.
it affect people older than 1 year?
So truly the risk is highest for like 3 months old. But because the consequence of a botulism infection in an infant, the risk of death is so high that we're really giving this huge safety buffer and saying it is not worth it to even the tiniest risk of a botulism infection for a baby under 1, because the consequences are so severe. So just avoid it until you hit the year mark. That's why.
And so adults, it doesn't affect adults or anything?
For pregnant women can be a little bit of at a higher risk, but you know, if you're, or like an immunocompromised person, so that's kind of iffy. I believe, I haven't practiced in cancer in a while, but I believe some places tell their cancer patients not to consume raw honey, as well as pregnant. Some places tell their patients to only consume like pasteurized honey, but I couldn't tell you for sure on that one. I just know for infants, it's just not worth the risk. Other unsafe foods would be like choking hazard foods. So popcorn, raw apples, anything with like small bones in it, like fish. You want to make sure it's a well deboned fish, sausages or hot dogs. We don't want to be offering to infants. Deli meats, we shouldn't really be offering to infants because it's super high in sodium, and the floppy texture of it can be a risk. Untoasted bread below, like, gosh, when your kids between 10 and 12 months should not really be offered to infants because they can make it into like a chewy ball in their mouth. Candies, really that like unsafe food. And then as far as like raw fish, so sushi, for example, a lot of people ask about sushi. In the US, recommendations are often to avoid sushi with raw fish. However, in other countries, raw fish is served to infants under 12 months. So you have to decide for yourself if that's important for you culturally. And also, what is the quality of the sushi grade fish that you are using to make sushi, and what is the
So don't get it
textures?
at the convenience store?
No. No. Yeah. So, I mean, but other than honey and choking hazards and their allergens, and then like candy, there's not really any foods we should be avoiding. I recommend avoiding added sugar for under 2 when possible, but for sure under 1. We want to avoid things like cakes, cookies. We don't need to be offering any juice. We also don't need to be offering milk, the beverage, to infants until they turn 1. Then we can start offering them milk. Not like formula breast milk. Okay, not other types of milk, to clarify.
Even like still Milo like, we're just not a juice family. And again, I think it's because I don't drink juice. So it just, like, never occurs to me. We have juice boxes in the fridge, and, like, maybe once every 2 weeks, he'll, like, have a juice box. But yeah, it's just not something. But when I think about how much juice we drank when I was a kid, it's like, how am I still alive? Like, do you remember, like, going to the grocery store, getting the frozen things, and you, like, put it in the jug with water and you mix it up, and it's like, or like,
I had those, like,
Kool-Aid.
squeezy bottles that, like, you twisted off the, like, top of, like, the wax cap and you drank out of those. That's what we had.
Yeah, like, it's wild. Ugh.
Yeah.
Anywho, okay, this was super helpful. We went through all the questions.
Good.
So I just want to reiterate that girl's account was Kid Food Explorers, and then the other thing you mentioned was Start Solids.
Solid Starts. They have a
Solid
database of, like, how to prepare foods based on the different age of kids. It's a really great resource for families.
Okay. I love that. Well, thanks so much. Tell us where people can find you, about your courses, your YouTube, all that stuff.
So you can find me on Instagram at growing.intuitive.eaters. You can find me on TikTok at dr.taylorarnold. You can find me on YouTube at Growing Intuitive Eaters. And I offer free courses for parents on how to feed their kids while also establishing healthy relationships with food. So all of my courses are 100% free for anybody who needs them. And they are full, complete, no gimmicky, no upsell courses. Like, they are just out there free, because I believe this information is so important and everyone should have access to it. So I have a Start Here course, Growing Intuitive Eaters, how to help your kids have a healthy relationship with food. I have Feeding Baby 101, how to introduce solids to your baby. It covers a lot of the things, or everything we talked about today. How to introduce allergens. How often should your baby eat? What about iron? How much should be on your baby's plate? How to build your baby's plate? What should you do first? What about cups? What about water? All of that is free inside my Feeding Baby 101 course, and that also comes with a free ebook. So check that out on my YouTube. I have a Variety 101 course on how to help prevent and reverse picky eating. And then I have Milk 101, which I realize I need to be more creative with my titles. How to introduce milk. And then Constipation 101, how to address constipation. I am a scientist. I am a clinician. I am a creator, but I am not the most creative person when it comes to words. So clearly I need to work on my titles. But all of those courses, super useful, and have helped a lot of people. And I hope that if you're listening, you'll take a peek at them and it might help you too.
I love that. Thank you. I'm going to send my sister all your courses, obviously.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, well, thanks so much. It was so lovely to chat with you again.
Yeah, it was great to talk with you too. Thanks for having me on.
And I'm on a roll.